winter of 1941, the world froze. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's grand invasion of the Soviet Union, had begun with unstoppable momentum. 3 million German soldiers crossed the border that June, advancing hundreds of miles across the plains of Eastern Europe. By December, that momentum had vanished beneath snow and blood. The Eastern Front had become the coldest battlefield in human history. Temperatures plunged to 40 degrees below zero. Rifles froze solid. Engines refused to start. Bread became as hard as stone. Frostbite devoured flesh faster than bullets. In diaries recovered from both sides, the same phrase appears again and again: the cold is the enemy. By January 1942, the German army was collapsing outside Moscow. The Wehrmacht's summer uniforms offered no defense against the Russian winter. Soviet soldiers, accustomed to the cold, counterattacked with brutal efficiency. Thousands froze to death where they stood, rifles in hand, eyes open, bodies encased in ice. Entire divisions vanished beneath the snowdrifts, buried by storms that lasted for weeks. Yet in that frozen silence, soldiers began to notice something else. War on the Eastern Front was not just fought with bullets and tanks. It was fought with isolation, endless white, endless silence. When the shelling stopped, men could hear their own blood moving. Psychologists later called it snow blindness of the mind. The constant reflection of white light and the absence of sound created hallucinations. At least, that's what the report said. But among the tens of thousands trapped in the blizzards of 1941-42, some experiences could not be explained away by exhaustion. One German private, Franz Keller, wrote in his field journal on January 3rd, "The wind speaks when the shells stop. It calls by name. It called mine last night." 2 days later, his squad found Keller outside the trench, barefoot in the snow, eyes glazed, frostbitten to the bone. He was still alive, repeating the same word, "Komm heim, come home." He died before dawn. The entry ends with his sergeant's note: he left no tracks in the snow. Stories like this were dismissed as battlefield hysteria, yet the pattern continued on both sides of the line. Soviet commissars documented similar incidents. Men vanishing during whiteouts, patrols found dead in circles as if drawn toward some unseen center. One report from the 33rd Army's Medical Division states, "Symptoms of auditory delusion, uniform across separate platoons." Voices from storm direction, commands to advance when no such orders were given. The Army psychiatrist blamed exhaustion. The soldiers called it the whispering snow. By February, the snow had become more than weather. It was an environment of the dead. Every gust revealed a boot, a hand, a frozen face staring upward. Burial was impossible. The ground was iron, so the bodies stayed, markers of an army slowly petrifying in place. Those who survived described hearing movement under the ice. Not animals, not men, something else. A Soviet lieutenant named Anatoly Chernov wrote, "The snow cracked beneath me and a hand reached up. I thought it was a survivor. But it was blackness, not frostbite, black like coal. When we dug, there was nothing there." His letter never reached home. But a year later, when his unit retook the same position, they found his handwriting etched into a metal mess tin, buried under 2 feet of ice. For historians, the first winter of the Eastern Front marks the beginning of modern mechanized despair. No front line in history recorded such consistent psychological collapse. German units reported mass hysteria, soldiers firing at snowbanks, claiming to see shapes moving against the blizzard. Soviet forces described enemy patrols that vanished upon contact, leaving only footprints leading into open plains. To the military, these were anomalies of stress. To those who were there, they were encounters. From the archives of the 6th Army captured at Stalingrad, a line appears in a December 1941 transmission. "Unknown lights north of Sector C, not flares, not ours." That radio message was logged, then redacted. The operator who filed it, Corporal Reinhold Hesse, was found later that night frozen at his station. His hand still gripped the transmitter key. His mouth was open as if mid-word, and yet the wire record shows the signal continued for 33 seconds after his death. Engineers later blamed atmospheric interference. But to those who read the report today, It sounds like something else had finished the message. The winter of 41 wasn't merely cold, it was ancient. The kind of cold that remembers. Men who fought there described the feeling not of being surrounded by snow, but of being watched by it. It was as if the land itself resented intrusion, an elemental presence testing every intruder, German or Soviet alike. Even seasoned officers began to refer to certain sectors as haunted zones. One such region, outside Vyazma, was nicknamed the White Valley. No patrol sent there returned intact. On February 18, 1942, a 12-man German patrol from the 3rd Panzer Division entered that valley to recover a downed reconnaissance plane. They never reported back. A week later, a second group went searching. What they found remains one of the most chilling field records of the war. The patrol stood upright in the snow, all 12 men, rifles in hand, in perfect formation. No wounds, no signs of combat. Their faces were twisted as if caught mid-scream, eyes white with frost. Their captain's watch had stopped at 2:17 a.m. A camera was recovered from one of the soldiers. Its final frame showed only a blur of movement behind the trees, a smear of black against the white. Taller than any man, shape unclear. When the negatives were sent to headquarters, the courier plane carrying them vanished en route to Smolensk. No wreckage was ever found. In the chaos of the Eastern Front, official reports buried the unexplainable. Blame the cold, blame madness. But among those who survived that first winter, one conviction persisted, that in the stillness between battles, when even the wind stopped moving, something else walked the snowfields. Not German, not Russian, something older, something that fed on silence. This was the winter of 1941, where the dead did not always stay still, and the snow remembered every step. By the second winter of the war, the Eastern Front had become something beyond a battlefield. It was an open grave that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea, a place where millions fought, froze, and disappeared into the white. The blizzards of 1942 brought more than cold. They brought stories, whispers passed between trenches, carried in the breath of dying men, and written in letters home that were never delivered. Historians call them trench rumors, superstitions born of hunger and sleeplessness. But among soldiers on both sides, Soviet and German alike, the same phrases appear in their diaries and letters. Phrases that shouldn't repeat unless they describe something real. One Soviet infantryman, Ivan Borodin, wrote to his wife in January 1942, "The nights here are not quiet. Even when the shelling stops, the snow speaks. Sometimes it calls by name and sometimes it cries like a child. I have stopped answering." Borodin's letter never reached his wife. It was intercepted by censors, marked unfit for morale. He was killed 2 weeks later outside Rzhev. The Germans had a name for it too. They called it Der Flüsterwald, the Whispering Forest, a stretch of dense pine between Smolensk and Vyazma, where entire patrols vanished. According to Wehrmacht field reports, the trees there produced acoustic anomalies. Men claimed to hear movement in the branches, even when the wind was still. Footsteps pacing behind them, perfectly in sync. Whispered commands in perfect German, but from voices no one recognized. Some psychologists later suggested it was the effect of snow acoustics. Sound travels differently in extreme cold. Words bounce and distort. But the soldiers who heard those whispers insisted the voices weren't echoes. They were responses. One diary recovered from a frozen corporal named Lenz reads, "When you speak softly, it listens. When you fall silent, it answers. Do not listen back." His entries stop mid-sentence on February 4th. The page after that is blank except for faint indentations, as if someone had pressed the pen hard against the paper without ink. The shape of the lines resembles sound waves. Soviet troops had their own legends. To them, the whispers weren't the forest. They were the dead. At night, when the temperature dropped and fog rolled in from the marshes, soldiers swore they could hear singing, low and mournful, carried on the wind. They called it the Song of the Fallen. According to superstition, to follow the song meant joining it. One letter, found sealed inside a soldier's tobacco tin near Lake Ilmen, contained only 2 lines. They sing for warmth, But the more you listen, the colder it gets. These were not isolated incidents. Across hundreds of miles between opposing armies, the same auditory phenomena appeared. Whispers in empty trenches, voices under the ice, phantom songs that led men astray. It didn't matter which uniform they wore. The Eastern Front swallowed them all the same. Declassified. Red Army intelligence files mention an experimental study conducted in late 1942. Psychiatrists from Moscow's Military Institute were sent to observe abnormal auditory patterns reported by frontline soldiers. Their conclusion, quote, mass neurosis induced by prolonged isolation and hypothermia. But one of the researchers, Dr. Yelena Voskresenskaya, left an unsanctioned note in the margin. She wrote, I interviewed 9 men from different regiments. Each described hearing a female voice calling their name. The dialect varied. Some said Russian, others German. But one word was constant, come. Voskresenskaya died later that year in a hospital fire. Her notes survived only because they had been sent to an archivist days earlier. German records reveal a similar investigation by a psychological warfare unit, Sonderkommando 22B, operating near Bryansk. They initially believed Soviet loudspeakers were projecting recordings through the forest to demoralize troops. So they staged a counter-operation. Silence all generators, all communications, wait for the voices. What they heard, one officer wrote, did not come from any human mouth. No broadcasting equipment was found, only an abandoned Soviet bunker, its walls scratched with hundreds of names. Every name matched a casualty report from the same sector. Could all of this be explained by stress, exhaustion, the echo of artillery bouncing through the valleys? Perhaps, yet the reports continued, identical words, identical phrasing, across languages, distances, and months. It was as if the snow itself remembered the voices of the dead and spoke them back, distorted through the wind. A natural recording, some might say. Others something older, a memory in the land itself, repeating its pain. One of the most chilling accounts came from a German field radio operator, Gefreiter Wilhelm Faber, stationed near Velikie Luki in late 1942. Faber was known for precision, a disciplined man fluent in Morse, never prone to fantasy. His surviving audio logs were recovered from a half-buried command post in 1944. The final entry is dated December 29, 1942. The transmission begins normally. Weather report, coordinates, routine status. Then halfway through, the line goes quiet. Seconds later, a new voice enters the frequency. Not in code, not in static, human, soft breathing. Wilhelm, it says. Wilhelm, 3 times, each repetition fainter, as if spoken from inside the snow itself. Faber answers, his tone tense, confused. Who is this? Identify yourself. No reply, he transmits again. This time the voice returns, but now it's his own voice repeating the same question, seconds delayed. Not an echo, a mimic. The log ends abruptly at 23:47 hours. When his commanding officer entered the radio tent the next morning, Faber was still seated at his desk. The transmitter key was frozen beneath his hand. The window was open, snow piled high on the floor, and the receiver, still humming, whispered one last word. Cult. Cold. Whether the voices were tricks of atmosphere or something else, the pattern was undeniable. They appeared when the killing stopped, when the world went quiet enough to hear the snow breathe. The soldiers called it the forest's revenge, the earth speaking through the mouths of the dead, warning the living to remember what they had done. On the Eastern Front, silence was never empty. It carried every whisper, every name, every cry lost to the wind. And sometimes it whispered back. In February of 1943, the German advance in Belarus had ground to a halt. The forests around the Berezina River had become a no-man's land of snow, smoke, and silence. Among the scattered Wehrmacht divisions, holding that frozen territory was a reconnaissance detachment, 2nd Company, 12th Infantry Regiment, commanded by Lieutenant Karl Heinemann, 28 years old, meticulous, known among his men for keeping a notebook even in combat. On the morning of February 17th, Heineman's squad received orders from regimental command. Proceed to coordinates 54 dig 19N, 28 to 31 EE. Confirm presence or absence of partisan activity. Report findings, a routine patrol. But what they found there would never appear in official reports. The location was a small rural settlement, name unknown on any map, roughly 20 wooden houses clustered around a frozen well. According to Heineman's field log, snowdrifts reached shoulder height. The air was still, unnaturally so. Even the birds were absent. They arrived at 14:23 hours. The first thing they noticed was the smoke, thin threads curling from several chimneys, as if fires still burned inside. The second thing, no people. Sound, door creaks open, faint echo of wind through wood. The men entered cautiously, rifles raised. Inside the first house, the fire was still glowing in the stove. 2 bowls of soup sat on the table, half frozen. Bread sliced, teacups filled. No signs of struggle. No overturned furniture, no blood. Just absence. Every house was the same. Beds unmade, meals abandoned, candles still burning low in wax. Even livestock remained in their pens, silent and unmoving, as if waiting for someone who had simply stepped outside. Heineman wrote later, "It was as if time had stopped midway through an ordinary afternoon. Not destroyed, not looted, simply emptied." At 15:10 hours, one of his corporals, Otto Reich, called him to a barn at the edge of the settlement. There in the snow they found dozens of footprints, small, barefoot, leading from the barn toward the woods. The track stopped abruptly halfway across the clearing, fading into the ice as if pressed into glass. The corporal suggested a snowdrift had covered them. Heineman disagreed. The surface was smooth, untouched. He noted the phenomenon in his logbook, adding only 2 words beside it: impossible surface. The squad established a temporary outpost in the village, intending to wait until morning for clearer visibility. They lit stoves, checked perimeters, and reported to command by radio. The reply crackled through at 16:47 hours. No other units nearby. Maintain position. That was the last clear transmission they ever received. Around dusk, one of the men, Feldwebel Brandt, took a reconnaissance photograph of the main street using his Leica camera. The image was meant to document the condition of the houses. When developed later, it showed more than it should have. Behind the windows of 3 separate buildings, faint silhouettes appeared. Human shapes, indistinct, elongated, blurred as if moving during exposure. Yet according to Heineman's own notes, every building had been empty when they entered. The patrol remained through the night. Snow began to fall around midnight, heavy and dry. The men reported hearing distant movement, footsteps pacing through the drifts outside, though no one was visible. At 020 hours, the radio operator, Corporal Rieck, began picking up strange interference. Heineman's log records, frequency distortion. Sounds resemble breathing. Adjusted tuner. No improvement. Voices faintly audible behind static. He ordered the set shut off until dawn, but sometime near 03:30, without any of them touching the equipment, the radio switched back on. The log continues. Voices repeating words in German and Russian. Not clear. Identified my own name among them. Moments later, the radio operator began to scream. The rest of the squad rushed into the signal room. Rake was sitting upright, headset on, eyes wide, hands locked around the transmitter key. He was unresponsive, still breathing, but unable to move. The headset emitted a single steady whisper. "Bleib here. Bleib here. Stay here." Heineman tore the cable from the generator. The whisper continued for 10 more seconds before fading. At first light, they prepared to withdraw. But during equipment check, 2 men were missing. Brandt, the photographer, and another Private Kruger. Their tracks led into the center of the village and ended in front of the frozen well. Heineman described the scene in his final field entry. Surface intact. Ice unbroken. But looking down, I thought I saw movement beneath, like shadows circling. I called their names. The echo answered back, not my voice. Fearing collapse of the ice, the remaining soldiers retreated. By 080, visibility worsened again. Clear fog rolled in, thick, metallic, smelling faintly of ozone. One soldier claimed he heard whispering from inside the houses, like people murmuring through walls. Another swore he saw figures moving between doorways. When they fired warning shots, the fog didn't react. It simply swallowed the sound. Heinemann ordered immediate evacuation. Of the 10 men who entered that village, only 3 reached base the next day. The rest were never found. For years, the incident was classified as disappearance due to enemy ambush, but no evidence of partisans was ever discovered. The surviving men, Heinemann among them, were transferred east shortly after. Heinemann himself was reported missing in action later that same year at Kursk. Only his field notebook survived, recovered decades later in the Belarusian archives, declassified in 1991. Inside its final pages, beneath the last dated entry, he had written a single paragraph in a shaking hand. "I saw them again tonight, standing behind the windows. Their mouths moved but made no sound. They wanted us to stay. Perhaps we never left." Beneath it, the ink trails off into a line that continues to the page's edge, as though the pen was pulled away mid-stroke. The lone surviving photograph, the one taken by Brandt, was archived separately under File 402B. Experts who examined it decades later found something strange in the film grain. Embedded between frames, visible only under magnification, were faint concentric rings, patterns resembling ripples on water. And within those rings, distorted forms, human faces, mouths open, blurred as if caught mid-scream. Some suggested it was a double exposure, others a trick of the light. But the technician who developed the negatives refused to handle them again. He said when he held the film to the light, he heard a faint sound like distant radio interference. Today, no trace of that village remains. Its location on maps is blank, an unmarked clearing reclaimed by forest. Yet locals still call the place by an old name whispered through generations, the place that breathes in winter. Hikers who venture too close report hearing voices through the trees, names spoken softly, in languages they don't know, and sometimes when the snow falls just right, the air carries a sound like a radio signal trying to break through. A static that shifts, bends, and finally forms the faintest echo of a scream. By the spring of 1943, the Red Army had learned to stop retreating. The Soviet counteroffensive had driven the Germans westward across the rivers and forests of occupied Belarus. In that chaos, abandoned positions and field hospitals dotted the countryside. Temporary shelters turned into monuments of suffering. Among them was one location the archives list only by its coordinates 53 to 42N, 27 to 59E. There in March of 1943, a platoon from the 64th Soviet Infantry stumbled upon something that would never appear in official reports. The 64th was a veteran unit, soldiers hardened by 2 winters of mud, hunger, and death. Their commander, Captain Mikhail Antonovich Lebedev, was known for his precision and discipline. On the 14th of March, his unit was tasked with sweeping a forested area near the village of Ostrovyanka. Intelligence suggested a retreating German medical detachment had left behind supplies and possibly wounded. Lebedev's orders were simple: recover the wounded if possible, capture any remaining enemy, and secure medical resources for the Red Army. They expected to find a ruin. What they found instead was a field hospital that seemed frozen in time. The building had been a church once, a small Orthodox chapel, its cross torn down and replaced with a red and black medical flag. Inside, the air was heavy with rot and antiseptic. Cots lined the nave, arranged in perfect symmetry, as if the German doctors had left only hours before. According to Sergeant Yuri Pavlenko, the first man to enter, everything looked untouched: scalpels, instruments, even a tray of bloodied bandages still damp. But there was no movement, no voices, no sign of life. And then they noticed the beds. Each bed was occupied. Dozens of German patients lay there, eyes open, mouths frozen mid-breath. At first, the Soviets thought they were corpses. Then Pavlenko lifted a blanket. The soldier beneath had been nailed to the bed frame. Thick iron spikes through wrists and ankles. His chest cut open, the organs gone. But his expression, his face, still twisted in agony. The same was true of every bed. Every man nailed down, every body desecrated. And no sign of struggle. No overturned chairs, no broken glass, no blood trails, as if they had all been conscious waiting for it. In the official debrief, Lebedev described what happened next. My men began shouting for the doctors. No one answered. We searched every room. In the surgical tent we found the same. Instruments laid out, patients mutilated. But the surgeons were gone. They found footprints leading out into the forest. Dozens of them, some barefoot, others booted. The track spiraled into the trees and then stopped, as if the people had simply ceased to exist. Lebedev ordered the area secured and sent a runner to headquarters. While they waited, he began cataloguing the dead. Each corpse, Soviet medical officers later noted, showed signs of post-mortem movement. Fingernails broken, teeth shattered from biting down. In one cot, a soldier's eyes were gone, but the optic nerves had curled outward, stiff like wires. The discovery was immediately classified. A Soviet intelligence detachment, SMERSH, arrived the next morning. They photographed the scene, collected the reports and burned the remaining documents on site. Lebedev and his men were ordered never to speak of what they saw. The official statement filed under case number 382 designated the site as a product of psychological warfare. The report claimed the Germans had staged the mutilations to break Soviet morale, an attempt to fabricate horror, but the men of the 64th knew better, because the bodies weren't staged. They were still warm when they arrived. Decades later, one surviving soldier, Private Andrei Mishenko, broke silence during a 1982 interview for a Belarusian oral history project. His testimony was sealed, but the transcript resurfaced after the Soviet Union collapsed. He said, "We thought the Germans had gone mad. But when night came, the wounded began to move." Mishenko described how after dusk, faint sounds echoed through the hospital, metal groaning, wood creaking, low moans beneath the floorboards. One soldier swore he heard someone whispering in perfect Russian, repeating the same word, "Zdes." Here, Lebedev ordered everyone outside. They took positions around the church. From within, the noises grew louder, screams overlapping, hundreds of them. But when they broke the door open, the sound stopped instantly. Inside, nothing had changed. The bodies still nailed to the beds, but their mouths were open now. To this day, historians debate what really happened. Some claim the soldiers suffered from shared trauma, the cumulative psychosis of endless war. Others suggest a form of mass hysteria, triggered by biological decay and echoing architecture. But there is a pattern the archives can't explain. In the weeks following the discovery, every member of the 64th reported nightmares identical in detail. A hospital lit by flickering lamps, dozens of figures lying still, and the sound of someone walking slowly between the beds, humming a tune none could identify. Soviet censorship buried it all. Even in wartime, the state feared panic more than the enemy. The military newspaper Krasnaya Zvezda printed a short notice that week. "Enemy atrocities continue. Our soldiers remain vigilant. No mention of nails. No mention of screams." In the late 1960s, local villagers rebuilding the chapel uncovered remnants of iron embedded deep in the floorboards. Experts from Minsk removed the artifacts for study. They were never returned. The site today stands empty, a foundation of scorched stone overgrown with moss, yet residents still avoid it. And they say that on winter nights, when the wind comes down from the north, it carries a smell of burning antiseptic, and a sound beneath it, faint but unmistakable, the rattle of bed frames shifting in rhythm, as though someone were still trying to move. The last known official who visited the site was a Soviet colonel from military intelligence, Viktor Sidorov, in 1947. His private journal, declassified after his death, includes one unsettling note. There were no bodies left, but we heard them. Under the floorboards, still breathing. Sidorov recommended that the ruins be burned to prevent local superstition. The next day, the church was set ablaze by Red Army engineers using kerosene and phosphorus. The entire structure collapsed within an hour. Witnesses described the fire as unusually loud, not roaring, but screaming. When the flames died, the snow around the building had turned red, though no blood was found. Officially, the 64th Infantry's discovery remains a classified anomaly. Unofficially, it stands as a story soldiers never stopped whispering about. The night they found a hospital full of the dead, who would not stay still. Lebedev, the captain who ordered the fire, disappeared on the front 2 months later. His body was never recovered, but his last field note survived, preserved in a comrade's journal. "We burned the place, but the screams didn't stop." The city of Pskov lies near Russia's western border, an ancient fortress town surrounded by endless pine forests and frozen rivers. It was among the first Soviet territories captured by the German army in the summer of 1941. What most soldiers saw there was ruin, churches burned, villages abandoned, and the frozen corpses of civilians caught in retreat. But for a small division within the Schutzstaffel, Pskov was something else, a treasure map of forgotten gods. Within the SS existed a secret organization known as the Ahnenerbe, the Ancestral Heritage Research and Teaching Society. Its mission, authorized directly by Heinrich Himmler, was to uncover traces of the ancient Aryan civilization the Nazis believed to be their spiritual ancestors. In public, it was an academic institute. In reality, it was an occult expeditionary force, searching for artifacts that blurred the line between science and myth. During the occupation of Pskov, one of these units, officially listed as Sonderkommando K-16, was deployed to study ruins discovered in the forests east of the city. The ruins were unlike anything else in the region, a collapsed stone structure half buried in the tundra, its walls carved with symbols that predated both Slavic and Norse alphabets. Locals called it Chernaya Kapella, the Black Chapel. According to surviving documents recovered after the war, the expedition was led by Hauptsturmführer Dr. Reinhard Voss, a historian from the University of Munich turned occult researcher. Voss reported directly to Wolfram Sievers, the Ahnenerbe's general secretary, and had previously participated in expeditions to Tibet and Karelia, searching for Aryan relics. In his field report dated September 12, 1942, Voss wrote, "The site lies within a clearing surrounded by unnaturally twisted pines. The stones hum faintly under contact as if charged. Local peasants refuse to approach, claiming the place is accursed by the old gods." He described discovering fragments of bone idols within the ruins, elongated figures with no faces, only spirals carved where the eyes should be. Each idol was etched with a repeating symbol, a circle intersected by 3 inward-pointing blades, similar to a triskel. That symbol would later reappear, but not in any museum. Over the next 3 days, the Ahnenerbe team began excavation. Photographs recovered from the Reich archives show 12 men working under floodlights, hauling ancient stones from the pit, while storm clouds gather above. One caption reads simply, "The air feels charged." At 16 on the 3rd day, radio logs record a sudden weather anomaly. A storm rose out of a clear sky, winds exceeding 100 kilometers per hour. The dig site was struck by lightning repeatedly, though no storm had been reported anywhere else in the region. When a nearby Wehrmacht supply unit reached the camp the next morning, half the team was dead. Their tents were shredded, the generator melted into slag. Every compass and watch had stopped at the same moment, 03:17 hours. The survivors, including Dr. Voss, were found disoriented, burned, and unable to speak. One soldier, delirious with shock, repeated the same phrase in broken German. The idols sang. The surviving Ahnenerbe members were evacuated to Riga for medical evaluation. 2 died en route. Voss survived barely and was transferred to Berlin for debriefing. He wrote a 17-page personal report that was never officially submitted to Himmler. That document resurfaced after the war. Found among files seized by the US Army's Operation Paperclip investigators, it reads more like a confession than a scientific paper. "The storm was no accident," Voss wrote. "It rose from the pit as if something beneath had awakened. I saw forms moving through the rain, shapes like the idols but alive, this faceless, tall, walking against the wind. When the lightning struck, they looked at us without eyes. He claimed that after the incident, the Ahnenerbe ordered all artifacts sealed in crates marked Wissenschaftliche Proben nicht öffnen, scientific samples, do not open. Those crates were sent by rail toward Königsberg. The train never arrived. For decades, historians dismissed the Pskov account as Nazi superstition, the fevered product of men obsessed with myth. Yet there are peculiar details that lend it a chilling plausibility. First, the storm. Meteorological records from September 1942 confirm an unexplained atmospheric disturbance centered exactly where the Black Chapel site once stood. Second, the symbol Voss described, the three-bladed circle, appears again years later in unexpected places. In 1944, Soviet counterintelligence recovered a uniform belonging to a fallen German officer during the Battle of Narva. Sewn into the lining was a small piece of bone carved with that same mark. The Soviets filed it under Enemy Propaganda Object, a Category B. Then, the artifact vanished. What was the Black Chapel? Some archaeologists now believe it was an ancient pagan sanctuary dating back over 3,000 years, older than recorded Slavic religion, possibly linked to a forgotten Finnic or Baltic cult. Others suggest something more disturbing, that it was never a place of worship, but of containment. Voss's journal makes one final cryptic statement. The stones were not built to honor them. They were built to keep them inside. After the war, American and Soviet researchers independently searched for the ruins. They found nothing, no chapel, no idols, no stones. Satellite imagery decades later shows only a scar in the earth, a perfect circle burned into the forest floor. Dr. Reinhard Voss disappeared in 1945 during the fall of Berlin. His body was never identified, but in 1962, a Soviet major named Alexei Voronov led a military archaeology unit through the Pskov forests, searching for unexploded ordnance. Voronov's men uncovered fragments of human bone carved with the same three-bladed symbol. That night, a storm struck without warning. Local accounts describe thunder without lightning, and trees flattened outward from an invisible center. Voronov was killed instantly when his tent collapsed. When his body was returned to base, investigators found something inexplicable pinned to his uniform. A sliver of bone, tied with wire over his chest, marked with the identical sigil of the Black Chapel. No one claimed responsibility. No one could explain how it got there. Historians still debate whether the Ahnenerbe truly uncovered something supernatural, or whether the story was amplified by Cold War myth-making. But one fact remains. Both Nazi and Soviet records mention the same location, the same symbols and the same storms. Two enemies, united only by fear of what lay buried beneath the snow. In the archives of Berlin, one final line from Voss's diary remains underlined twice, as though he wanted the world to remember it. We did not find our ancestors in Pskov. We found their gods and they were still hungry. Years later, when investigators reopened the Soviet file on Major Voronov's death, they discovered something carved into the inside of his helmet. A phrase scratched by hand, the letters trembling as if written in haste. The chapel was not black when we found it. It turned black when it woke. July 1943, the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank engagement in human history. Thousands of machines, hundreds of thousands of men. Steel meeting flesh, fire meeting earth. The Soviet Red Army had fortified miles of trenches, bunkers, and minefields, waiting for the German offensive. The air was thick with smoke, cordite, and prayer. For weeks, the front had been a wall of sound, a constant roar. Until one night, the sound stopped, and something else moved in the silence. At IO-2 Maishaus on July 9th, a Soviet reconnaissance platoon from the 13th Guards Rifle Division reported movement behind their lines. At first, they assumed it was a German breakthrough, a flanking maneuver through the wheat fields north of Ponary. The scouts raised their binoculars. What they saw didn't fit the war they were fighting. Dozens of soldiers, marching in perfect formation, bayonets fixed, rifles slung. But their helmets were spiked, their coats long and gray, the fabric too old. Their formation was tight, disciplined, moving as one. And the sound, at faint, rhythmic, boots striking earth. No engines, no radio chatter, just the steady march of ghosts. The lieutenant in charge, Alexei Durov, radioed headquarters. Enemy detachment spotted. Approx company strength. Uniforms unknown. Request artillery strike. HQ replied with coordinates confirmed. Order fire for effect. At 0211, the Soviet 76mm batteries opened up. Shells arced overhead, screaming through the sky. Impact range, direct explosion, shockwave, silence, then the shapes kept moving. The observers watched in disbelief. The artillery fire walked across the field, blossoms of light tearing through the earth, but the marching figures didn't break formation. Each shell passed through them, bursting behind. No bodies, no debris. The air distorted like heat haze. And still they marched. The lieutenant shouted for illumination flares. A magnesium flare hissed up into the night, bathing the field in white. For a moment, the light revealed their faces, pale, hollow, eyes like pits of ash, mouths moving soundlessly. Every one of them wore the uniform of the Imperial German Army, not 1943, but 1914. Panic spread through the Soviet line. Machine gunners opened fire. Tracer rounds cut through the dark, clean hits straight through the torso, and still no effect. The soldiers advanced without speed, without sound, their boots pressing no tracks into the mud. A heavy gunner named Mikhail Sorokin described it later in his debrief. They weren't walking on the ground. They were walking through it. At 0230, contact was lost. Radio signals broke into static. Faint whispers mixed in with the distortion. When communication was re-established, Durov's unit was gone. A recovery team arrived at dawn. What they found defied every rule of war. The wheat fields were scorched, cratered by artillery, but among the shell holes they found trenches, not Soviet, not modern, hand-dug, narrow, reinforced with wooden planks, the kind used 3 decades earlier in the First World War. And inside those trenches lay bones, dozens of skeletons, half buried, still clutching Mauser rifles rusted into dust. Some wore rotted tunics, the others shattered helmets with faded Prussian insignia. The gravesite matched no known battle map. No records placed a German unit that deep into Russia in 1914. And yet, the insignia identified them as soldiers of the 79th Reserve Infantry Regiment, a formation annihilated near Tannenberg, hundreds of miles west. Nearly 30 years before, military investigators filed the report as erroneous identification of historical remains. But the strange detail was this. The trench walls showed fresh cuts, shovel marks not yet frozen or decayed. Someone, or something, had dug them recently. Among the remains, a Soviet soldier's radio was found, its battery drained, its casing scorched. When technicians examined the recording spool inside, they found 6 minutes of transmission, captured by accident during the chaos. Most of it was static, but under the noise, faint voices can be heard, overlapping German and Russian, as if 2 wars were happening at once. At minute 4, one voice stands out. A man whispering in German, "Wir sind nicht tot," "We are not dead." Then the recording cuts. Historians later tried to explain it. Some blamed misfired illumination, fog mixed with phosphorus creating illusions. Others said the soldiers stumbled across an unmarked WWII burial ground disturbed by shelling. But none of those theories explain what the survivors claimed they saw later that morning. As the sun rose over the plains, they reported distant movement. The same spectral battalion retreating west, fading slowly into the mist. Each step synchronized, each shadow dissolving into air. And the strangest part, on the horizon flashes of artillery, bright and rhythmic, though no units were firing. As if another battle were playing out beyond visibility. It wasn't the first time Soviet scouts reported such anomalies. For months before Kursk, patrols across the front had whispered about ghost trenches, sections of ground that appeared solid, then collapsed into empty voids lined with wooden planks. Rumors spread that the land itself was bleeding through time. One intelligence officer wrote in his log, "The past refuses burial, the dead refuse silence." When that line was later quoted in a post-war article, censors struck it out. They replaced it with, "War has long memories, but those who fought there knew the truth." Memory wasn't metaphor, it was manifestation. Weeks later, after Kursk was won, Soviet engineers clearing the battlefield stumbled upon another trench system 5 kilometers north of the original site. Inside were more skeletons, German, British, and Russian, all intermixed, as if armies from different wars had died side by side. One corpse wore a uniform so old, the fabric disintegrated at touch. Pinned to his breast pocket was a rusted locket containing a photograph of a woman smiling. The date on the back, 1916, but the skeleton's boots, brand new, Soviet issue 1943. No explanation was recorded. Forensic teams eventually sealed the area, marking it as contaminated zone due to unexploded ordnance. But locals in nearby villages still tell the story. On foggy nights, they say, the plains echo with the sound of marching feet, a hollow rhythm rolling through the wheat. If you listen long enough, you can hear the difference. The old cadence of another century, a slower beat. A forgotten war repeating itself. Official Soviet reports dismissed the Ghost Battalion as optical illusion, the mind's attempt to rationalize horror. But in a sealed file recovered from the archives of the 13th Guards, Lieutenant Durov's final note survived, written hours before his death. "We engaged the enemy last night. They were disciplined, fearless and silent. Their uniforms were wrong. Their eyes empty. They were still fighting their last war." In every war there are things that vanish. Men, tanks, entire battalions swallowed by chaos. But in the autumn of 1943, something far stranger disappeared along the railways outside Smolensk. Not a patrol, not a convoy, a train, an entire supply train. It was meant to be routine. Transport of ammunition, food and medical rations to the front lines near Yelnya. The route was secure, the track inspected, the weather clear. The train left the depot at 23:45 on October 12, 1943. It never arrived. Officially, it was Transport 7271, operated by the Soviet 15th Rail Logistics Division. Engine type FD-20-2514. Crew 11 men. Cargo manifest, munitions, rations, medical supplies, and one sealed container marked Special Research Materials. Radio contact was steady until 01:12 hours, when the train passed through a section of forest between two small stations, Krasny Bor and Vazovka. At 01:13 it vanished from every signal relay. No crash, no explosion, no wreckage. The rails themselves were undamaged. It was as if the train had been erased from the line. At first, the railway authorities blamed sabotage. Partisans had been derailing convoys for months, but aerial reconnaissance showed no impact sites. The ground radar units reported something stranger. A sudden electromagnetic disturbance over the forest that night, followed by complete radio silence for 6 minutes. Then everything returned to normal. No debris was ever found. For 3 days, the Soviet command classified the disappearance as enemy interference, possible new weapon. Then, on October 15th, Transport 7271 reappeared. At 03:04 in the morning, a signal operator at the Vazovka junction reported hearing the whistle of an approaching locomotive. He looked out his window and saw it, the same FD-20 engine emerging from the tree line. No lights, no smoke, just rolling silently toward the platform. The operator wrote in his log, "Train moving at steady speed, but no one visible in the cab. Windows black. No sound except metal against track." When it finally came to a stop, he approached with a lantern. The paint was blistered, warped as though scorched by lightning. The metal glowed faintly with residual heat. And the smell. Not oil, not smoke, something chemical, electric and wrong. The crew was still inside. Engineers found all 11 men at their stations, frozen in place. Eyes open, skin gray, hair bleached white. Every clock and watch on board had stopped at 1:13:07 exactly. The moment contact had been lost. One medic described it later as instantaneous aging. The men looked 70 or 80 years old, though all were in their 20s. Their flesh had hardened, almost mummified, but their uniforms were untouched. Inside the sealed cargo compartment, investigators found the special research crate. Its metal casing had melted into the floor. Whatever was inside was gone. The Ministry of Rail Transport immediately turned the site over to the NKVD. All personnel who'd seen the train were detained for questioning. Within 48 hours, the locomotive and its cars were loaded onto flatbeds and transported under heavy guard to an undisclosed facility near Kaluga. No photographs were ever released. No official reports were filed in public archives. The incident was erased, except for one internal memorandum, uncovered decades later by historian Dr. Sergei Melikov during the Glasnost reforms. The memo, dated 1944, was addressed to the Soviet Science Directorate. Its title, Anomalous Temporal Field Incident, Smolensk Sector. Melikov's discovery changed everything. The document described localized chronospatial distortion resulting in differential time displacement. In simpler terms, time itself had fractured. The memo claimed the event coincided with experimental radio frequency transmissions conducted by a nearby research group, Laboratory 12, part of the Soviet Scientific Directorate. Their project, codenamed Voзвrashcheniya, The Return, was studying high-energy electromagnetic fields for communications through disrupted terrain. But the experiment that night exceeded its power threshold. When the pulse was released, it collided with the train's electric systems, creating, in their words, a closed temporal reflection. Loop translation: the train slipped out of sequence, American. Intelligence learned of the incident years later through intercepted transmissions during the early Cold War, a 1949 CIA briefing, declassified only in 2008, refers to a Soviet chrono anomaly near Smolensk and describes it as a transdimensional transit or controlled time displacement event involving military hardware and human crew. The Americans called it the cursed train of Smolensk. They compared it to the wartime Philadelphia experiment, another supposed military test gone wrong. But what they didn't know was that the Soviets had tried to reverse engineer the phenomenon. According to later testimony from defector scientists, the wreck of Transport 7271 was stored for years in a sealed hangar under continuous electrical containment. Every few months the metal would hum, as if remembering motion. Witnesses described strange effects inside the hangar. Guards reported seeing shadows of moving figures through the train's windows, though no one was aboard. One technician swore he heard voices, men speaking Russian, then German, then something else entirely. When he approached, the sound stopped. But on the metal hull, frost had formed in the shape of fingerprints, dozens of them pressed from the inside. At least 3 researchers assigned to the wreck later went missing. Their personal belongings were found near the train. Their watches had all stopped at 0113. By 1952, the Soviets sealed the entire site. Official explanation: structural contamination. Unofficially, no one wanted to hear the train move again. Modern physicists still debate whether time can truly fracture, or whether energy distortion can displace matter in temporal folds. But the evidence, the burned engine, the aged crew, the missing cargo, remains unexplained. In the 1980s, a declassified satellite photo showed the abandoned Kaluga depot. In the center of the complex, a single railway line led into a steel hangar. Thermal imaging revealed something colder than the surrounding ground, perfectly rectangular. The dimensions matched an FD-20 engine, as if the train was still there. A survivor's family later came forward, the son of engineer Viktor Pavlov, who vanished aboard 7271. In 1971, he received a telegram written in his father's handwriting. The date stamp was unreadable, only the time, 0113. The message contained one sentence: "We are still on the line." The telegram paper showed signs of extreme age, as though written decades earlier. Experts couldn't explain how it had been delivered. Some say the train still runs, not in this world, but along the same track, repeating its journey across the gap it tore in time. Sometimes railway workers near Smolensk claim to hear an approaching whistle in the fog, though no train is scheduled. The signal lights flicker red, the rails hum, and then nothing. Just the echo of wheels rolling through another century. Silence, Faint static begins building. They said time froze. But something was still moving inside. By 1944, the forests of Belarus had become the hidden lungs of the Soviet resistance. Entire partisan brigades lived among the birches and marshes, ambushing German patrols by day, vanishing into mist by night. To the outside world, these woods were sanctuary. To those inside them, they were alive. Among the thousands who hid beneath those canopies, there is one story that refuses to die. A story whispered by survivors and censored by the state. The story of the Witch of the Forest. The first record comes from the diary of Captain Yuri Antonov, commander of the 7th Bryansk Partisan Battalion. In early March of 1944, Antonov's unit engaged German troops near the village of Strelka. It was a disaster. Half his men were killed, the rest wounded and lost in the snow. Antonov's surviving notes read, "We dragged the wounded through the forest for 3 days. Food gone, ammunition gone, men dying one by one. Then we saw the smoke." He described a single cottage deep in the woods, a structure of moss and timber, its roof sagging under the weight of snow. Inside lived an old woman, white-haired, barefoot, her eyes pale as frost. She called herself Maria Ivanovna. According to Antonov's account, the woman offered food and shelter. She spoke little but understood everything. When she saw their wounded, she began to work. She boiled herbs we did not recognize. She spoke to the wounds as if scolding them. The bleeding stopped. The fever broke. Men who had been dying sat up and smiled. By dawn, every injured soldier was breathing easily. They called her a miracle worker. Antonov called her something else. She healed too fast, and her hands were cold. The men stayed 3 days. Each morning they awoke stronger. Each night the forest around the cottage grew unnaturally still. No birds, no wind, no insects. On the 4th day they prepared to leave. The woman refused payment. She only said, "The forest gives and the forest takes. You have borrowed from it. You must give it back." Antonov thought it a superstition until the screams began. 2 days after they left her hut, the first man died. No bullet wound, no fever. He simply collapsed, convulsing, clutching his chest. Then the second. Then the third, Antonov wrote. They screamed as if burned alive from within, skin turning gray, eyes black, no blood. No cause. By the week's end, 7 were dead. The survivors buried them in a clearing, soil frozen hard as stone. Antonov sent a courier to report the incident to Moscow command. The message never arrived. When the Red Army retook the region later that month, word of the Forest Witch spread through local garrisons. Wounded soldiers sought her out, desperate for her healing. Each time she accepted them without question. And each time, days later, their bodies were found lifeless and pale, mouths frozen mid-scream. Some claimed she was a demon, others a saint. To the villagers who lived near her, she was something older than either. They said she had been there long before the revolution, long before the Tsars, that she had never been young. They said she belonged to the forest. By April 1944, NKVD intelligence took notice. Maria Ivanovna was labeled a potential German collaborator using psychological, manipulation or chemical agents. A detachment of 6 agents was dispatched to arrest her and transport her to Moscow for interrogation. According to the operation log, the unit departed the village of Polotsk at 0600 hours. By 08:15, their convoy was seen entering the tree line near the Bryansk frontier. They were never seen again. 3 days later, a reconnaissance patrol found their trucks abandoned on the forest road. Engines off, fuel tanks full, no tracks leading away. Inside one vehicle, a single revolver lay on the passenger seat, every chamber empty, every bullet missing. The logs end with a single notation from the commanding officer: Operation incomplete. Area quarantined. No further action advised. Then the file disappears from record until 1957, when fragments of it were rediscovered during NKVD archive consolidation. Most of the pages had been blacked out or burned. Only one partial memo survived, a field report titled Subject Entity M. Ivanovna. It reads, "Subject displays anomalous healing phenomena. Suspected temporal displacement or biological adaptation beyond known medicine. Agent Tikhonov reports direct eye contact, causes disorientation. Final transmission ends abruptly at 8:47 hours. Sound of screaming followed by static. No one returned to the forest for years. When a new partisan memorial was built nearby in the 1970s, workers uncovered fragments of human bone beneath the moss. 6 skeletons arranged in a circle. All faced inward. At the center was a small clay bowl filled with ash and frostbitten herbs. No official record linked them to the missing NKVD convoy. But one archaeologist quietly noted that the bones belonged to men of the right age and period, and that each skull showed a hole bored cleanly into the forehead as if something had been taken out. Local folklore never forgot her. Hunters still tell of an old woman wandering the woods at dusk, carrying a lantern made of bone, humming to herself. When wounded animals cross her path, she touches them, and they rise whole again. But their eyes are wrong afterward. They no longer blink. Every winter, villagers leave bread and salt on the forest edge, an offering or a warning. In 1989, a declassified NKVD communication confirmed that the case of Entity M. Ivanovna was real, though reclassified under a new heading. Unresolved folk phenomenon. Psychological warfare study. The closing paragraph is chillingly bureaucratic. All information regarding anomalous civilian healers shall remain sealed until scientific consensus provides rational explanation. Until such time, dissemination of materials concerning the so-called Witch of the Forest is forbidden. The report ends with a marginal note in blue ink. Subject presumed deceased, but the handwriting is shaky, as if the writer didn't believe it. What was she? A remnant of older faiths? A woman born with a gift that humanity mistook for witchcraft? Or something else entirely? Something that traded life for life? The last line of Captain Antonov's diary, found decades later in a museum archive, offers no comfort. It simply reads, "Her eyes were kind, but when she touched me I heard the forest whisper my name. He died 3 days later. No wounds, no illness. His face frozen mid-scream. They say that in those woods no one truly dies, not while she still walks between the trees. She heals what the war breaks, but everything healed must pay its debt. And when the wind moves through the birches at night, some swear they can hear her voice, gentle, patient, waiting. The forest gives, and the forest takes. War is invention. Every side searches for a weapon the enemy cannot match. Faster tanks, deadlier bombs, deeper lies. But in the final months of 1944, both the Third Reich and the Soviet Union began searching for something else. Not a weapon of steel or fire, a weapon of the unseen. And it led them both to the same place, a forest outside Minsk. Official history records that by late 1944, German forces were retreating on all fronts. But behind collapsing lines, the SS Ahnenerbe, the same occult research branch that had sent expeditions to Tibet and Pskov, continued its work. Declassified Allied intercepts refer to one such effort under the code name Operation Nachternte, Night Harvest. At the same time, Soviet intelligence launched a mirror project, Directive 913, directed by the NKVD's Department of Experimental Sciences. Neither side knew the other existed. Both were trying to weaponize the same discovery, something ancient unearthed beneath. The ruins of a pre-Christian temple near Minsk, the temple ruins, had been uncovered accidentally when a German engineer battalion began constructing a fortified bunker complex in the summer of '43. Workers reported strange vibrations in the ground, not seismic but rhythmic, almost like a pulse. One officer noted that the concrete would not set properly in certain sections. It cracked overnight as though rejecting the foundation. In August, an Ahnenerbe field team arrived. Among them, Obersturmbannführer Hans Krüger, an archaeologist turned occultist, and Dr. Reinhard Voss, last seen during the Skov excavation. Krüger's diary, recovered after the war, describes what they found. There is a structure below the soil, not built by men, 12 pillars in a circle, surrounding a hollow shaft descending into blackness. The air hums when you speak near it. By September, the Germans had converted the underground chamber into a laboratory. They called it Der Schacht, the shaft. Power lines were run from a nearby hydro plant. Equipment was installed: Tesla coils, cathode tubes, and strange instruments scavenged from abandoned research in Vienna. Witnesses later described a ring of mirrors positioned around the pit, reflecting light downward. Each bore carved runes mixed from Norse and Sanskrit. No one could read them, but Kruger claimed they were meant to focus the field. Meanwhile, as the Red Army advanced west, Soviet scouts captured fragments of German reports mentioning Nachternte. Moscow responded immediately, ordering Directive 913, the establishment of their own scientific countermeasure. NKVD officers seized every document they could find and dispatched a research team led by Professor Dmitry Korolev, a physicist once involved in early radar experiments. Their goal was simple: beat the Germans to whatever they were building. In early November, Soviet forces surrounded Minsk. Both sides occupied opposite ends of the same tunnel system. Neither realized how close they were. On the night of November 22, 1944, Allied monitoring stations in London and Washington recorded an unusual signal, a powerful burst of electromagnetic noise emanating from the Minsk region. Its pattern was unlike any radio transmission ever logged, a repeating pulse, 12 beats followed by silence. Then, at exactly 0:03 hours Moscow time, the signal spiked. Eyewitnesses across Belarus reported a sudden flash of light, brighter than lightning, soundless, lasting several seconds. Soviet troops stationed miles away saw the sky ripple as though struck by heat waves. In orbit, British reconnaissance satellites captured a brief, inexplicable light anomaly visible from space. Everything within a 5-kilometer radius of the ruins ceased transmitting. When Soviet reinforcements arrived 2 days later, they found nothing. The forest was scorched in perfect concentric circles, the trees carbonized but still standing. The underground bunker was gone, not destroyed but missing. An enormous crater marked the spot where Der Schacht had been. No debris, no bodies, no machinery. Just melted stone and a residual glow that made compasses spin, radiation detectors pegged off scale. Soldiers who entered without protection developed severe burns on their faces within hours. Those who returned alive reported hearing whispers from underground, voices speaking in Russian, then German, then overlapping both. Moscow classified the incident immediately. All references to Directive 913 were sealed under experimental weapon malfunction. But Allied intelligence continued to investigate. A declassified OSS cable dated February 1945 reads, "Intercepted Red Army field report indicates loss of experimental division during test of energy-based weapon. Soviet command denies event. British photo reconnaissance confirms light event visible from upper atmosphere. Local population evacuated due to unknown radiation phenomenon. Recommend continued monitoring for transdimensional anomalies. The term transdimensional appears 3 times. After the war, American investigators under Operation Alsos scoured the ruins of Minsk. They found fragments of metal fused with sand, not bomb debris, but mirror shards. Each fragment emitted a faint magnetic field and a low hum at 19 Hz, the frequency associated with human fear response. In 1963, Soviet geologists drilling near the same area reported radiation anomalies extending hundreds of meters below the surface. In their logs, one phrase appears repeatedly: zone of invisible light. Satellite imaging later revealed a faint circular distortion in the soil pattern, 12 points around a central void, the same number of pillars described in Kruger's diary. Both sides lost something that night. The Germans lost their final miracle weapon. The Soviets lost an entire research division. But something else may have been gained, or released or declassified. American radiation surveys from the 1980s recorded fluctuating bursts near the site every 11 years. The same cycle as the Sun's magnetic reversal. Each time, the anomaly spikes in both radiation and acoustic frequency, producing a sound like distant thunder underground. Locals call it the breathing earth. They say that sometimes On still nights, light flickers beneath the soil, like the glow of furnaces burning deep underground. Others claim to hear voices through the ground, men shouting in two languages at once. One theory suggests that both sides, in their desperation, triggered a shared event, two frequencies colliding, two rituals overlapping, tearing the air between them. A fusion of science and superstition so violent, it burned a hole in time itself. When fragments of Kruger's final diary page were recovered in 1946, a single sentence survived. They said it was light. But the light had teeth, and from the Soviet side, a surviving memo from Professor Korolev to his superiors, written hours before the event. We are not summoning anything. We are knocking, to see if someone knocks back. Today, the site remains sealed, a restricted military exclusion zone 30 kilometers east of Minsk. Officially, it's used for storage of chemical waste. Unofficially, radiation levels still spike every few years without explanation. Geiger counters tick faster near the old forest line, then fall silent, as if the machines themselves are listening. No one knows what was born in that bunker, or whether it ever died. The records end. The voices don't. They called it Operation Night Harvest. Both sides reached into the dark, hoping to reap power, but the dark reached back and took everything. Berlin, 1961. The city was divided, a scar running straight through history. Above-ground walls were being built. Below-ground archives were being opened. In the East German Ministry for State Security, the Stasi, hundreds of clerks sifted through mountains of captured Nazi and Soviet files. Documents no one had seen in decades. Among them worked Heinrich Adler, age 41, archivist second class. Quiet, methodical, invisible, he was the kind of man bureaucracy loves. He never asked questions. Until he found the file marked Class 5 Phenomena. The folder was unremarkable at first glance. Standard Soviet binding, sealed with wax. But the markings were strange. Half in Cyrillic, half in Gothic German script. No date, no classification header, only a single line typed in red. Joint Investigative Dossier, Phenomena Beyond Ordinary Physics. Access by authorization only. Adler logged the file's arrival, signed the transfer slip and carried it to his office. That was the last routine act of his life. Inside were 67 pages of mixed reports, Soviet and German alternating. Some stamped Ahnenerbe, others NKVD Directorate 913. The first entry was a Soviet field note from 1944, referencing an event near Minsk. The next, a German intelligence dispatch describing manifestations of identical light phenomena. But what startled Adler were the descriptions, identical accounts from both sides, written in different languages, describing the same thing: tall, luminous entities emerging from fog. Height approximately 3 meters, faces undefined, movements inconsistent with gravity. One German witness called them Die. Gefallenen ohne Schatten, the fallen without shadows. The Bayern Soviet report translated, the same phrase as beings of reflected light. Adler, trained in cross-referencing propaganda, assumed the file was forged, an example of mirrored disinformation. But the signatures were genuine. High-ranking names appeared on both sides. Colonel Viktor Sidorov, SS Obersturmbannführer Reinhard Voss. Men already connected to earlier classified projects, each testified to identical events, sometimes on the same dates though miles apart. Each ended the same way, with reports of blinding illumination, sudden radio interference, and complete memory loss among survivors. In one margin, Adler found a handwritten note in pencil, likely by a Soviet translator. The phenomenon does not differentiate sides. It answers only attention. He paused over that line for a long time. Over the next weeks, Adler became obsessed. He began translating the entire file into German for personal study, working late after hours, long after the other clerks had gone home. He wrote notes in the margins, cross-linking events with other recovered materials: Kursk, Pskov, Smolensk. Threads of a single hidden narrative. Colleagues later recalled he looked pale, sleepless, as if he had been reading too much in the dark. One co-worker joked that he had caught a ghost in a folder, Adler didn't laugh. On November 14, 1961, he submitted an internal request for clarification regarding Class 5, asking whether it referred to radiation exposure or paranormal activity. The request was denied. The next day, the file disappeared from his office. His supervisor claimed it had been recalled to Moscow for consolidation. Adler insisted it had been taken locally. The logbook supporting him was altered overnight. His signature erased. The line beneath his entry rewritten in another hand. By Friday, he stopped coming to work. Police found his apartment immaculate. Coffee cup washed, bed made, lights off. The only unusual object was a tape recorder left running on his desk. The tape inside was blank, except for a faint mechanical hum, and then 3 minutes in, a voice, whispering in German and Russian simultaneously. "It remembers us." Experts later said it was audio distortion caused by overlapping frequencies. But the voice matched Adler's own, and yet not his tone. The official Stasi investigation concluded suicide by exposure to classified materials. No cause of death was listed. No body was ever recovered. In 1991, after the collapse of East Germany, a historian named Anja Reiter gained limited access to surviving Stasi archives. Among thousands of destroyed files, she found a single envelope labeled Adler. Heinrich deceased. Inside were 3 pages, his personnel record, incomplete. A medical form marked no autopsy performed, a typed memo dated 2 weeks after his disappearance, addressed to Department of Extraordinary Occurrences. It read, "Archivist Adler compromised through exposure to Class 5 dossier. File recovered and resealed under Joint Soviet-German Intelligence Authority. Access now limited to Level Omega." The memo's footer was signed by both a Soviet colonel and an East German administrator. No department called Extraordinary Occurrences exists in any government record. When Reiter tried to trace the original Class 5 phenomena dossier, she discovered something stranger. Its archive number was duplicated, one copy listed in East Berlin, another in Moscow. Both had been checked out within the same week of Adler's death. Both vanished from inventory the next day. Reiter's notes on her findings end abruptly. Her final entry, handwritten. The same handwriting appears in both logs. The same initials, 2 cities, 1 hand. She died in 1993 of what police called an electrical accident. Her apartment burned. The power grid in her district registered no surge that night. Today, Class V phenomena remains untraceable. Its registry number has been overwritten by unrelated materials, agricultural reports, mundane trade correspondence, layers of paper concealing absence. Yet fragments surface occasionally, carbon copies in forgotten collections, stray references in declassified memos. Always the same description. Entities of indeterminate origin, non-local, luminous, capable of inducing mass amnesia and structural damage through proximity. In both languages, German and Russian, the phrase non-local is underlined twice. Neither side ever defined it. Archivists deal in memory. Paper is their battlefield. Ink their weapon against oblivion. But what happens when the thing you record looks back? When history itself refuses to be filed? Adler may have been the first to notice that the Class V reports weren't about one war. They were about all of them. Every major conflict, every zone of destruction, contained sightings of the same light forms. Each time they appeared at the edge of annihilation, as if feeding on it, or preserving it. His last marginal note, found scribbled on a torn envelope in his drawer, reads, "They do not come for victory or defeat. They come for the record." No Stasi file lists Heinrich Adler as dead. His name ends mid-column without a date of closure. In bureaucratic language, that means case open. Some say the lights seen over Minsk in 1944 were recorded again over East Berlin the night the wall was built. Same pattern, same silent glow. And in a forgotten storage room beneath the new German Federal Archives, there's a single cabinet, permanently sealed with red wax. Its label has been painted over, but under ultraviolet light, 3 words remain faintly visible. Class V phenomena. They say paper forgets nothing. But sometimes it remembers too much. April 1945, Berlin was dying. The Reich had fallen to ash and silence. A city without heartbeat, a mausoleum built of smoke and stone. Every building burned, every street reeked of death and gasoline. For the soldiers of the Red Army advancing through the ruins, victory felt less like triumph and more like disease, spreading, inevitable, devouring everything in its path. It was in this final push, amid the wreckage of the world, that they saw it, the fog. Reports from multiple Soviet battalions described the same anomaly, a dense mist rolling in from the direction of the Tiergarten, thick as smoke, but cold as winter. At first they assumed it was chemical residue, the result of burning fuel depots, but it moved wrong, not with the wind, against it, like something alive. Eyewitness Lieutenant Alexander Kirillov wrote in his after-action log, "Fog approached from west. No breeze, no rain. It climbed uphill. It came toward us like it knew the way. By nightfall, the fog had swallowed entire streets. When they fired flares into it, the light bent, not reflected, bent as if swallowed by something unseen." At first, the soldiers joked, after all they'd seen, what was a little mist? They'd survived tanks, shells, and snipers. What could fog do? But then the whispers began. Private Nikolai Petrov described it best. It was like standing in a room full of people breathing. You couldn't see them, but you could feel them. Every exhale against your skin. The voices were faint, overlapping, but men, women, even children, all saying the same phrase, "We are all the same." At first in German, then Russian, then something older, like a prayer with no God left to answer. Panic spread through the ranks. Visibility dropped to nothing. Men fired into the fog, bursts of muzzle flash that vanished instantly, swallowed by white. One soldier swore he saw silhouettes moving through it, staggering shapes, uniforms half burned, half rotted. Another claimed he recognized faces. German officers, dead comrades, even his own brother lost at Kursk. They walked with their hands out, one survivor wrote. Not attacking, not begging, just reaching. When the fog touched bare skin, frost bloomed instantly, even though the air was warm. And the bodies they'd buried days before began to move. The graves around the Reich Chancellery had been shallow. Hundreds of corpses, both Soviet and German, stacked and burned, then covered in rubble. Now the rubble shifted. Hands pushed through the ash. Fingers curled. Not living. Not dying. Something between. Kirillov's report ends mid-sentence. The dead rise through fog. Faces without color. They do not attack. They only... Then nothing but smears of ink, as if his hand had trembled too hard to finish. Headquarters lost contact with 3 companies that night. When dawn came, the fog was gone. The streets were silent. The radios filled only with static, but within that static, faint voices distorted, repeating, "We are all the same. We are all the same." The Soviet command blamed phosphorus smoke from German fuel stores. Medical officers cited exhaustion, shell shock, gas hallucinations. Yet among the surviving troops, a different story spread, that the fog had been born from the earth itself, from the millions buried beneath Berlin. A resurrection, not of life, but of memory. The war had devoured 40 million souls. Each trench, each crater, each frozen forest, filled with the unburied. Perhaps the fog was only their collective breath, rising at last in defiance of silence. Perhaps it was something older, the earth exhaling after years of feeding on blood and smoke. Whatever it was, it left marks. Men who had walked through it came back changed. Their eyes filmed gray, their skin cold to touch. They spoke less, slept less. One officer, after returning to Moscow, hanged himself in his apartment. On the wall, written in charcoal, was a single phrase, "Victory has no side." For decades, the incident was buried in classified medical archives. But in 1978, a declassified document from the Soviet War Institute referenced mass perceptual contamination phenomena during final assault on Berlin. It included one chilling line. Observed vapor appears to interact with electromagnetic fields. Contained voices correspond to confirmed deceased personnel. No scientist ever confirmed the report's authenticity, but the evidence, hundreds of identical testimonies, suggests something extraordinary happened that night, and perhaps something merciful. Because not every voice in the fog spoke of fear. Some soldiers claimed they heard their mothers calling. Others heard lullabies, hymns, the songs of home. One German prisoner said he saw his child, barefoot, glowing faintly in the mist, reach out and whisper, "It's over now." He dropped his rifle and wept. Moments later, the fog lifted. His unit surrendered without another shot. Historians call it coincidence, but the pattern remained. The closer soldiers came to death, the more familiar the voices became. As if the fog shaped itself to memory, a mirror of guilt, a reflection of all that war had taken. When the red flag was raised over the Reichstag, the fog was gone. The streets were dry, the silence absolute, but some swore they could still smell it, that faint metallic scent of blood and ozone, lingering like unspoken confession. One Soviet commander wrote in his journal, "I saw victory that day, but it looked like the dead forgiving the living." No one quoted that in the official record. They preferred numbers, medals, maps, things that didn't breathe back. What was the fog? Science will say vapor, faith will say souls, but every man who saw it, German or Soviet, conqueror or defeated, described the same final moment. When the mist touched them, they felt no fear, no pain, no hatred. Only one truth echoing endlessly through the smoke of all wars: we are all the same. For a heartbeat, the battlefield vanished. The uniforms, the languages, the sides. Only faces, human, broken, forgiven. Then the fog dissolved into air, leaving behind nothing but silence. The war ended that week, but for those who walked through that mist, the world never started again. They said their dreams turned white, blank, endless, waiting. As if the fog had followed them home. Perhaps it did, because somewhere in the archives of the Soviet War Institute lies a sealed report labeled Phenomenon 45B, Atmospheric Anomaly, Berlin Sector. Its final line, written by an unknown hand, reads, "In that fog, victory lost all meaning. Wars are supposed to end. Borders change, treaties are signed, and the dead are buried. But history doesn't forget so easily. It lingers. In the ground, in the walls, in the static between radio frequencies. And sometimes it speaks back." In the decades since 1945, researchers and historians have tried to understand what really happened on the Eastern Front. Not just the battles, but the strange phenomena buried beneath them. Fog that moved against the wind, trains that returned from nowhere, files that erased themselves, and voices in the snow that refused to stop calling names. They called it the Ghost War. At first it was folklore, dismissed by academics as superstition born of trauma. But then came the evidence. A Soviet technician intercepts an unmarked radio signal near Kaluga. They're repeating broadcast of what sounds like German Morse code, though the signal strength fluctuates in impossible patterns, rising and fading in sync with the lunar cycle. The message, when translated, reads, "Still here, still marching." 1977. East German scientists conducting electromagnetic surveys in Belarus detect frequencies registering faint human voices, speaking in Russian, Polish and German simultaneously. The audio is archived, then sealed. When modern researchers reopened the file in the 1990s, the voices were still audible. And among them, one phrase repeated over and over: "Report in, report in, report in." By the late 20th century, interest in psychogenic warfare anomalies resurfaced. Declassified NATO intelligence from the Cold War references lingering radiological irregularities at former battlefields, especially near Minsk, Smolensk and Pskov. Sensors recorded brief electromagnetic pulses synchronized across hundreds of kilometers. No known source, no natural explanation, and then came the photos. 1992. A Finnish hiking team exploring abandoned German bunkers near the Belarus border finds a rusted camera frozen in mud. The film is miraculously intact. When developed, it shows blurred images of men in uniform, World War II patterns, but the background is wrong. Satellite dishes, power lines, modern technology. The photos shouldn't exist. The negatives were confiscated by Belarusian authorities within days. Official statement: forgery. Unofficially, 2 of the hikers vanished that same year. Across Europe, isolated patterns repeat. Farmers near Kursk report hearing phantom engines under the soil. Geiger counters click in the absence of radiation, and on certain nights, when thunder rolls across the plains, faint lights shimmer above old trenches, forming the outlines of marching. Paranormal historian Dr. Pavel Kiriv describes it as a memory loop of violence replaying itself through the medium of the earth. He believes battlefields are not just places, but recordings. That trauma, when concentrated enough, imprints on the environment like magnetized tape, and every few decades, under the right conditions, those recordings play themselves back. Some scientists have begun to agree. Infrasound, electromagnetism, atmospheric resonance. They give the ghosts names that sound like equations, but none of them answer the question, why only here? Why does Eastern Europe, more than any other front, still echo with the dead? Maybe because the war never ended there. Not truly. It simply changed shape, from flesh and blood to light and memory. From battles fought in trenches to frequencies humming in the dark. In 2003, a team of Russian engineers surveying an abandoned military radio bunker near Minsk recorded an unexplained signal at 27.4 MHz, identical to a German field transmission frequency used in 1944. It lasted 2 minutes and 12 seconds. When decoded, it contained this message: to all units, the fog is moving again. The signal source was traced to coordinates corresponding to a destroyed Soviet communications tower. The tower had been demolished in 1959. No one could explain it. The deeper researchers dig, the more the evidence begins to feel less like history and more like a warning. These echoes are not random. They appear where great violence occurred, where memory refuses burial, as if the earth itself insists on remembrance. Maybe that's what ghosts are. The memory of suffering so heavy that even death can't carry it away. Maybe the Eastern Front was never a line between armies, but a wound too deep to close. Today, scattered across old archives, there are still sealed files marked Unexplained Phenomena, Class 5. They exist in Berlin, Moscow, Warsaw, even Washington. Each tells fragments of the same impossible story, of soldiers seen decades after their deaths, of photographs that develop images of things no longer there, of voices bleeding through static, whispering the same words that were heard in the fog of 1945. We are all the same. These are not legends anymore. They are data points, and the more they're studied, the less they belong to folklore, and the more they begin to look like truth. Still, the governments stay silent. Documents vanish. Witnesses are discredited, and the old battlefields remain sealed, fenced off, labeled as radiation zones. But the locals know better. They say that every spring, when the snow melts and the ground breathes again, you can hear it, faint low like thunder underground. Marching. Endless marching. The ghost war still moving across the soil, invisible but eternal. One Belarusian farmer described it simply: the war doesn't end when men stop fighting. It ends when the land stops remembering. And this land has not forgotten. We like to think history belongs to the past, that its ghosts stay buried, its horrors locked in photographs and textbooks. But the Eastern Front refuses to sleep. It murmurs through the airwaves. It glows in the soil. It hides in classified archives labeled with numbers instead of names. If you tune your radio to the right frequency on a stormy night, between channels in the static, you might hear it too. A whisper, a footstep, a single line spoken through 70 years of silence. We are still here. Wars end when their stories are told. But on the Eastern Front, the stories never stopped whispering. If you can still hear them, in the fog, in the static, in the hum of broken frequencies, don't turn it off. Record it, remember it, because memory is the only grave the forgotten have left. Subscribe to this archive of the strange. Listen deeper, and join us where history never sleeps, and the war still whispers,